Hello, and thank you very much for coming along once again to Eco Views and News. This evening we're going to take a long look at a recent crisis. It looks recent if you look at the headlines, but in fact it's a long and long-standing problem that's emerged over about 500 years. 500 years of transformations that leave us in our current situation, which looks like a contemporary crisis. It is a contemporary crisis because it's affecting everybody who's alive right now, but it took a while to get to this circumstance, and in order to address it correctly, we need to understand a little bit about the history and trajectory of the transformations that have led us to this current circumstance. It has to do with the globalization of food production. Briefly put, what's happened is that the world has become divided in a very significant way the last 500 years. We've been growing food for the last 10 or 12,000 years in organized city farming village systems. It's not as if agriculture is new, but that hasn't been globalized. And there are reasons for that. It has to do largely with the weight of food. Food is largely made up of water content, certainly vegetables, and that water content is fairly heavy. It's hard to carry it very long distances. So you want to basically consume the food close to where it's being produced, so the transportation costs aren't that great. Now, several things start to intrude upon that very quickly and change the system of food production. And you can imagine them right off the bat. Anything that increases the capacity to transport food will give a different range of distances over which you can easily take food from where it's grown to where it's consumed. So transportation revolutions are crucial in understanding what might be called the wider and wider scope of a food system. Food systems are pretty local until transportation revolutions make them possible to include larger and larger areas of affected regions where there's a distance between production and consumption. This happens in a dramatic way with the expansion in the last 500 years of European maritime empires. Maritime empires are ones that are built on trade on the ocean. If you master long-distance trade on the oceans, you can have a radical impact on an emerging food production system, producing some things in one part of the world and transporting it to another part of the world until it's consumed. This is one of the huge revolutions of the last 500 years in the post-Columbian moment. That is, after Columbus bumped into the New World. Let's not say he discovered it. He didn't find it because it wasn't lost. But in any case, he connected, and those who came after him, connected one part of the world with another hemisphere of the world. And in the process, food production systems were radically transformed, because long-distance trade in foodstuffs became possible, and very quickly, as we'll see, became necessary. So we're going to be talking about this in terms of the globalization of food production, and looking in particular at the beginning of this period of the maritime empires. We're not taking it back into the empires around the Mediterranean, or the Chinese empires, or the Southeast Asian empires, all of which deserve their own specificity and detailed study. But we're looking at the Atlantic plantation system and the origins of Africa's food crisis. Now, I'm saying a food crisis, and it isn't my terminology. It's actually coming out of the headlines. In fact, you can't avoid coming up with these kinds of headlines from things like the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, with titles like Fixing Africans' Agriculture, as if it's broken, right? It's broken, but we have to fix African agriculture. Several sub-Saharan countries are facing food insecurity. Well, this is a very interesting development and very true in many respects. Not new in other respects. But food insecurity becomes an anxiety these days, and African countries are said to be facing it. One of the reasons for that, according to BBC News, is that Africa is missing out on the biotech green revolution. Fewer crops are now feeding the world, there's uncertainty hampering food security, and can science help improve food security? These are all questions being posed in reference to Africa these days, and we'll come back to these over the next few weeks as we look at this problem in greater detail. But just to get a sense of the emerging typification, that is, characterization of Africa as in the midst of a food crisis, take a look at some of the headlines. Once again, UN is warning of soaring food prices. Well, who's going to get hit by soaring food prices? Well, a whole series of countries, but in particular in Africa, where the number of hungry is still rising, according to a UN report back in 2009. Global hunger is worsening after 2009 and 2010, and Democracy Now! And others have carried stories about that. As U.S. and other wealthy nations slash aid, UN warns of silent tsunami of hunger. Very interesting phrase, a silent tsunami of hunger in a global food crisis. Take a look.
The program is called a silent tsunami of hunger. It's been described as the worst food crisis since the 1970s. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization, more than 1 billion people, or 1/6 of the world's population, go hungry every day. Last year alone, 37 countries experienced riots over skyrocketing food prices. But the world's richest nations have slashed their funding for food aid to their lowest levels in 2 decades. The World Food Programme warned this week that more than 40 million people will have their food rations reduced or eliminated because of the drastic aid cuts. According to Josette Sheeran, the head of the World Food Programme, wealthy nations, quote, think the world food crisis is over. But in 80% of countries, food prices are actually higher than 1 year ago.
For more on the food crisis and the related crisis in agriculture, we're joined now by an award-winning Indian journalist, writer, activist, Devinder Sharma. He closely monitors how international agriculture, biotechnology, trade policies negatively impact food security and farming communities in the global south in general, and in India in particular. Trained as an agricultural scientist, he's the author of GATT and India, The Politics of Agriculture, GATT to WTO, Seeds of Despair, and In the Famine Trap. We welcome you to Democracy Now! In the Famine Trap. That's what we're talking about all over the world. Explain what the problem is, the scope of it.
Well, let's be first very clear, there is no shortage of food in the world. We have about 6.7 billion people on the earth, and we produce food for 11.5 billion people. There is no shortage. It's only that one part of the world is eating more and one part of the world is starving. And I think that's a distribution problem, the political problem that we need to address.
Okay, a distribution problem, not a production problem, according to this expert. We're producing enough, it's just not getting distributed. Well, this is one way to characterize it, but it has its roots in a system of production that is really quite interesting, and one that we ought to look at in detail in terms of the globalization of food production. What has happened here since 1492? Well, the Atlantic Plantation system and the origins of the crisis can lead us some way toward understanding this problem, dilemma, enigma, whatever you want to call it. The Atlantic Plantation system, of course, includes both the Americas and Africa. And we want to look at the two aspects of that. It's often thought that the plantation system has to do with the Americas, and you can sort of forget Africa, but that's not true. In fact, it's crucially important to understand how Africa is engaged in the plantation system in the transatlantic trade. It's very clear from the early maps at the time that what was advantageous for the Europeans was to settle these islands and create plantations on them, in part because it's easy to control the labor supply on an island. All you have to do is monopolize the means of transportation, and your labor supply can't leave. You can import your labor supply. In fact, you have to in the New World in many cases, because diseases wipe out the local populations very quickly on the Caribbean islands. The importation comes from areas which you can get people exposed to similar kinds of conditions and a new disease pool that isn't all that strange to them, namely a disease pool related to the European disease pool. And that's why the Caribbean islands are systematically, even if you look at them from space, are closer, especially when they come under the control of particular European enterprises like the European colonial regimes or the British, the French, Spanish, Portuguese, and the like. They're related to each other across that what used to be thought of as a divide, but with new systems of transportation become now linked very directly in a system of trade. The West Indies, as you can see from these old maps, agreeable to the most improved maps and charts by Mr. Kitchen. You can actually see these illustrations from the old maps at the time and begin to analyze the trading that starts to take place, not only from Africa but to the Caribbean, but from the Caribbean to Europe, back down to Africa, and engaged in the Asia trade around southern Africa. Very interesting triangular trade, and all of the European powers get engaged in it. The Dutch are out in the Spice Islands in Indonesia, what we now know as Indonesia, and they are engaged all along the coast of Africa, along with the Portuguese, the English, the German, and French forts, all of which have their guns pointed out to sea, because their big rivals are not the local African populations. They don't have to work that hard to subdue the local African populations because they're trading with them. What they need to do is protect their trading enclave against rival Europeans. So their armaments are aimed out to sea to attack or be able to defend themselves from any seaborne attack of another European rival. You can see this in the islands that are right off the shore of Africa, like the island of Gorée, and look very carefully at the early maps. The maps are absolutely crucial in this understanding of the emerging transatlantic plantation system. And you can look at them in detail and begin to study them right down to the level of what's going on in every single locale. All of these islands off of the coast of Africa are crucial, and the overall logic of West Africa becomes linked with the West Indies, and it's for that reason historians have started to look at mapping the slave trade, because it's through maps that we understand these connections most clearly. If you look at the maps from the 1550s through the 1820s, you can really begin, especially now with digital technology, begin to analyze in detail what we thought of in very general terms and narrative terms previously. Now we can ask new kinds of research questions and look in detail at both the fortifications and things like this. These are, in fact, looking fairly small on the bigger map, but when you blow them up, they're indications of gardens. Very important, because as the plantation system gets going in the West Indies, on islands where labor can be controlled by monopolizing transport, new kinds of plantations start in Africa. Gardens were important to grow food for the Middle Passage, the crossing of the Atlantic by the slaves and ship's crew. If you think about the slave trade, that triangular trade that we mentioned a moment ago, for about 5 minutes, you can realize that people have to live on that whole period of transformation from one continent to the other. Doesn't do you any good as a slave trader to, as it were, buy your slaves in Africa and have them all die on the ship on the way over to the New World. You don't make any profit unless you sell a slave that looks pretty healthy, in fact, and can be proved to do work on the plantations in the New World. So, as a slave trader, you're very interested very early on in feeding your slaves fairly well, because you have to sell them with an appearance of being able to look, at least, and perhaps perform, even better, in a fairly robust way as a newly purchased slave in the New World. So a slave trader gets very interested very quickly in trying to provide food supplies that the slaves can eat in the Middle Passage and still look robust upon when they arrive in the New World. This leads to a very interesting set of problems if you think about it for about 5 minutes. The crops in the New World, the plants, are different than those in Africa. If people aren't used to certain plants, they don't often thrive on them. It takes a while to get used to them and to get used to an entirely new diet. In some cases, you can't get used to it and you reject it, basically. Further, if the nutrition's not good enough, you're susceptible to diseases. So if you're not well nourished and have a continuous supply of something you're used to, you're subject to rapid decimation through epidemic disease. Now what happens very quickly in the slave trade, well I say very quickly, in several decades to 100 years of experimentation, is that slave traders begin to realize they've got to feed people not only well, but they've got to feed them on things that they're going to be eating in the New World. Because it doesn't do you any good as a slave trader to show up with a whole cargo of well-fed Africans who are used to African food and can't make the adjustment to New World food. So when you look at these old maps and look at the garden plots and begin to ask yourself, okay, what are they growing in these garden plots? You can bet that they're not growing tulips, right? This is not a display for the tables of the European rich. This has to do with providing something for the Middle Passages of the slaves to the New World. Furthermore, that passage has to be followed by living in the New World on crops that they've learned to ingest and adjust to. Now the Europeans can sit in their forts amassing these slaves, as they do at the time, and get some very interesting fortifications designed to protect trading enclaves from rival Europeans. Their guns are always aimed out at the rivals, especially on these islands, because they want to store the slaves until their departure on their ships. They can store them in dungeons and in holds at the bottom of these castles, and they do, but during the time the slaves are there, which is until the winds are favorable to take them toward the West Indies, and the next ship arrives under their control that they can put these slaves upon, while they're being stored there, they're being fed crops, but not just any crops. They're being fed New World crops to see which of them can survive. The only slaves that get on the ships, or are put on the ships, I should say, are those that have already proved that they can do well on New World crops. New World crops that have been grown in these gardens around the different slaving castles. Now you'll see from these early prints that they made in the 1650s, 60s, 70s that most of the conflict is going on between the Europeans shooting at each other's ships to try to get access and protect, I should say, get access to or protect the slaving castles that they have on the islands or on the mainland. Military conflict took the form of naval battles between rival European powers to control the coastal enclaves or island fortresses. Europeans fought one another for control over coastal enclaves and dominance of the sea lanes for the sale of slaves to the Americas. It's not very far from the surface of any of these old maps what this is all about. This is a slave chain manacle. This is a leg manacle for a slave, right? And whether it's in Dutch or in French or in English, all of these different languages indicate very clearly what this is about. It has to do with control. And you can read it in these various travel books and memoirs written by sea captains or company directors, because these voyage accounts gave great detail about the slave trade and the preparation for its conduct. They provided maps, detailed maps that could be folded out. And here you can see the size of the book, and this is the size of the map. It's folded out and folded over several times. These detailed maps have a lot of information about purchased slaves and where to purchase them, for one thing, and specific information about the coastal forts, which are provided there in detail. If you look at them in detail, you can even get these inscriptions of how the slave trade takes place. Here are the forts on the coast, and here are the European ships waiting off the coast. Local canoemen bring these slaves, in this case they're indicated here as slaves, out to the ships and sell them in these kind of offshore transactions. They're in effect brought out from the dungeons where they've been held by the various European powers, French, English, Dutch, German, and even Danish. But on these diagrams, you know, they're indicated as A and B and C, and you can see where the Cape Coast Castle or the other castles on the coast are indicated, and the freemen here are selling these slaves there, bringing them out from the fortresses to the ships. Now, in almost every case of these coastal forts, you get some very interesting diagrams of these along with the text in the books. And when you start to look at the diagrams in detail, you begin to realize that almost every one of these forts has an indication of where they're getting their food supply. The plantations of crops that have to be laid out. These are plantations of New World crops. Why? Well, for the reason I was just mentioning. Basically, it doesn't do any good to arrive in the New World with a load of slaves who can't live on New World crops. So what you're doing in these plantations in Africa, right next to these slaving forts, is growing New World crops that can be eaten by the slaves, both while they're in captivity and in the hold of these dungeons until the ships come, and then on the Middle Passage itself. These New World crops were grown to feed to the slaves in that Middle Passage. And you can see in the maps in detail, here's a kind of floor plan of one of the maps. This is a map written in French, but looking at an English castle. It also has an indication of the Dutch term for it. Le Château is the French, to Castel is the Dutch underneath it. And in effect, here's the floor plan of the castle on the coast, and what's right behind it? Well, all the jardins in the French, or the tuinen here in the Dutch. These are basically the gardens that are laid out for growing things for the Middle Passage. And it's when you start looking in detail at these maps that you can figure out this is an enormous plantation system in Africa. So when you consider the plantation system of the Atlantic, you have to consider more than just the plantations for the production of cotton, tobacco, and sugar in the West Indies and the Americas. And you have to consider as an equal component, or a corresponding component, I should say, of that, the plantations of foodstuffs in West Africa, growing entirely new crops. You can look at some of these in detail and see there's a village involved, a local village engaged in the production of that food and provision of it to the castles. And you can probably read the text, which is in this case has a map both in French and Dutch, so there may be French and Dutch text to go with it, that specify what crops are being grown. They're being grown for, in effect, the New World. And that's what is fascinating about the evolution of the transatlantic plantation system. Now, what do you suppose they grew in their gardens? That's what we need to do further research upon. The Columbian Exchange has been looked at largely in terms of the biological and cultural consequences of 1492 for the New World, but not for Africa. This has yet to be done and needs to be done. What was the aspect of this Columbian Exchange for Africa? What were its consequences for Africa in the system? Well, we're going to look into this in terms of the ecological imperialism of Europe, 900 to 1900. Thank you very much. See you next time.